Okay, continuing on with my reading of Karl Marx's chapter on estranged labor from his 1844 philosophic manuscripts. We're on page 51 if you have the same version. Again, I'll try to link below if I remember. If not, you can go to the previous video in this series and just click on the link. That would greatly help because you're buying through my Amazon program. If this is something that interests you. I'm interested in this chapter in particular for Marx's discussion of the species being of humans, something which he dropped in his philosophy by the time he did Capital, or maybe he kept it and just didn't talk about it, but which I think is probably one of his more important ideas after his historical work on the experience of peasants in early capitalism, something for which we all ought to know, how we were removed from land, and if you weren't a European peasant, right, how you were stolen from your land, has great parallels. You're thrown together today in a history in a world with people whose land were stolen, along with people who were stolen from their land. Okay, continuing on. Let us now look more closely at objectification, at the production of the worker, and therein at the estrangement, the loss of the object, his product. Okay, so objectification, the worker producing, and estrangement, which is the loss of the product, what the worker makes. The worker can create nothing without nature, without the sensuous external world. It is the material on which his labor is manifested, in which it is active, from which and by means of which it produces. The worker can create nothing without nature, without the sensuous external world. It is the material on which his labor is manifested, in which it is active, from which and by means of which it produces. So, humans, as workers, right, need nature as a sensuous external world, the things we feel, the things we taste, the things we smell, the things we hear. It's part of our creativity. There is no creation, right? The labor, the creative labor, doesn't exist without nature. But just as nature provides labor with a means of life, in the sense that labor cannot live without objects on which to operate. I'm going to write the word means here. On the other hand, it also provides a means of life. So it means to and of, in a more restricted sense, i.e., the means of the physical substance of the worker himself. So, our flesh, our food, hopefully you can see why I kind of like this part of Marx, right? Thus, the more the worker by his labor appropriates the external world, sensuous nature, the more he deprives himself of a means of life, in the double respect. First, that the sensuous external world more and more ceases to be an object belonging to his labor, to his labor's means of life, and secondly, that it more and more ceases to be a means of life, in immediate sense, means of the physical substance of the worker. So, So one, more and more, it becomes external to him in the sense that, we are using the world in our work, right? But second, right, through pollution, right, we have, in my last review, I actually wrote pollution as well. You can see in the blue, I'm writing in red this time. Right, it's a means for physical substance of the worker is degraded. Thus, in this double respect, the worker becomes a slave of his object. First, in that he receives an object of labor, i.e., that he receives work. And secondly, in that he receives a means of substance. Therefore, it enables him to exist, first as a worker, and second as a physical subject. The extremity of this bondage is that it is only as a worker that he continues to maintain himself as a physical subject, and that it is only as a physical subject that he is as a worker. Well, we know this. We get sick, can't work. You're relying on the public dole the rest of your life. Right? Only as a physical subject that he is a worker. But we need to work, right, to maintain ourselves. Continuing on. The laws of political economy express the estrangement of the worker in his object. Thus, the more the worker produces, the less he has to consume. The more values he creates, the more valueless. The more unworthy he becomes. The better formed his product, the more deformed becomes the worker. The more civilized his object, the more barbarous becomes the worker. You see so many barbarous people today in our society. On both political sides, right? Maybe more so on one than the other. With that barbarity, though, what do you do, right? It's a result of the deformation of the worker who's produced too much, worked too hard. We in America work too hard. The mightier labor becomes, more powerless becomes the worker. The more ingenious labor becomes, so think about our tech, the duller becomes the worker. Think about how dumb our smartest tech people are. Just about the most basic things, right? The basic things. We want AI to support our base needs so that we can create. But instead, our smartest people, our most ingenious laborers in AI, are generating AI that creates creative products that are less and less valuable. So we can't even create. If we create it, we're not going to make enough money to survive. AI does exactly the wrong thing. The more ingenious the laborer, the tech laborer, the duller becomes the worker. And the more he becomes nature's bondsman. Political economy conceals the estrangement inherent in the nature of labor by not considering the direct relationship between the worker, labor, and production. It is true that labor produces for the rich wonderful things. In fact, the rich did very well in COVID. Psychologically, remember, was it David Geffen, billionaire, who posted his COVID spot as he was out on his yacht overlooking the ocean. Most of us were locked up in very small spaces, suffered major psychological damage, right? Even in the worst, and then our economy became such that the working class became poorer. The upper middle class became poorer, and only the richest of the rich got richer at that point. And we've done everything we can. Every radical choice we can make, we make. Except for it just makes it worse, right? Okay. But for the worker, it produces privation. I'm writing COVID here because last time I read it was before COVID, right? It produces palaces, but for the workers, hovels. For the worker, it produces lots of empty houses. Since 2008, you can go around a lot of beautiful places and there's lots of empty houses nobody's paying for. Because people can't afford them. They're just empty. Empty houses. And then there's homeless people. You believe that? There's empty houses. Giant, beautiful houses. Empty. But then there's also homeless people. There's no logic to that. Well, the logic of capitalism, which is an evil, evil logic, right, in this case. But look around our country. There are so many empty houses and so many homeless people. It produces beauty, but for the worker, deformity. Think about how deformed our arts are. Our popular arts. Skibbity toilet. What's the chicken one now? People say I look like, right? Not saying these are bad, I'm saying they're deformed. Beauty. They're not morally bad at all. They're kind of funny. Light humor. That's always been around, right? Think about 23 skidoo, the top saying of the 1920s. So now we're in the 2020s, 100 years later. You go from 23 skidoo to skibbity toilet. Most people wouldn't even make that connection. It's the same. Because the 1920s were also a point of the Rockefellers and Carnegies, right? Greater separation of the richest from the poorest. Deformity of beauty. You know, it's not the only beauty, but deformed senses of beauty. It replaces labor by machines, doesn't it? Tech. But it doesn't just replace labor by machines. It takes the machines and makes every job more onerous. There is not a technology that has made teaching better in my lifetime. In my career, since teaching, since 1997, there isn't a single technology that has come out that has made teaching better. Online learning is worse than in-person learning. The apps we use for discipline are worse than the little sheets of paper that you'd send to the principal, right? The programs we use for grades are less usable, less meaningful than the actual books that you're not allowed to use anymore, right? Every single technology, actual books are better than Kindles, right? Every single technology is worse. The newer books are worse than the older ones. Replacing labor by machines, but it's actually just machines are hooked onto labor to make labor onerous and terrible. Teachers had time to actually think and teach 25 years ago, 30 years ago. They don't now. Too much tech. But some of the workers, it throws back to the barbarous type of labor. Think about all the people in, 10-year-olds in Cambodia and stuff picking apart our discarded e-waste, right? Old tech, old motherboards and stuff, trying to get parts of it that are a little more like recyclable, right? Or reusable. A little more money for Bill Gates. A little more money for Elon Musk. But these kids, they end up dying by the time they're 20, being poisoned by all this tech, all this pollution we send to them. Yes, the stuff sitting on your lap in 10 years is going to be there. Maybe West Africa with kids dying young ages because they're poisoning themselves. All because of this way we've chosen. And the other workers, it turns into machines. Maybe that's what it's saying. Maybe teachers are being turned into machines. Doctors sure are. Oh my goodness. I'm afraid what happens whenever, the doctors currently doing all of their medical learning through ChatGPT and other AI who don't actually know anything are going to go and use their flowcharts. Lots is going to be missed. Lots is going to be missed. It produces intelligence, but for the worker, idiocy. Cretinism. I like the work they used intelligence. I'm going to put AI here because it produces AI, artificial intelligence, but for the worker, idiocy. Have a blessed day.